April 1945, Manchuria. The morning air hung thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood. In the village of Hulin, near the Soviet-Manchurian border, a young Japanese woman named Fumiko clutched her daughter's hand as they hid in the cellar of what had once been a schoolhouse. Above them, boots thundered across wooden floors. The sound was different from what she had known, heavier, more deliberate. Through the cracks in the floorboards, dust filtered down like ash from a distant fire. She pressed her palm against her daughter's mouth, feeling the child's warm breath against her skin, and waited. For months, the Japanese colonial administrators had told them the Soviets were coming. What they had not told them was what that would mean. For nearly 4 decades, Japan had built an empire in Manchuria, transforming the northeastern Chinese territory into Manchukuo, a puppet state that served as both industrial heartland and colonial experiment. By 1945, over 1 million Japanese civilians lived there, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, families who had been promised prosperity in what propaganda called the new paradise of the East. They had been told they were civilizing a backwards land, bringing order to chaos, light to darkness. The women especially had believed in the righteousness of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, raising their children in settlements that replicated Japanese villages, complete with Shinto shrines and community baths. They had lived in a bubble of imperial certainty, insulated from the brutality their military had inflicted across Asia, unaware that their safety depended entirely on the strength of the Kwangtung army. Then, on August 9, 1945, that bubble shattered. The Soviet Union, honoring its promise to the Allies made at Yalta, declared war on Japan and unleashed 1.5 million troops across the Manchurian border. The offensive was overwhelming, mechanical, unstoppable. The Kwangtung army, once the pride of the Japanese military, had been hollowed out by years of war, its best divisions transferred to defend the home islands. What remained collapsed within days. Soviet tanks rolled across the plains like a steel tide, crushing defensive positions that existed mostly on paper. And behind the tanks came something the Japanese civilians had not anticipated: revenge. The Red Army soldiers who poured into Manchuria carried with them memories of what the Nazis had done to their homeland. They had liberated concentration camps, walked through villages where every building had been burned, every well poisoned. They had seen their mothers and sisters violated and murdered. And though these were Japanese, not Germans, the distinction blurred in the fog of war and trauma. The Soviet command did little to restrain them. Orders were vague. Discipline, where it existed at all, was selective. In the chaos of August 1945, in the vacuum left by the collapsing Japanese administration, atrocities bloomed like dark flowers after rain. Japanese women and girls became targets. In village after village, testimony records what the official histories initially tried to bury: mass sexual violence, systematic assault, terror that lasted not hours but weeks. Fumiko, hiding in that cellar in Hulin, knew what was happening. Everyone knew. The screaming carried across the night. Women threw themselves into wells rather than face capture. Mothers killed their own children, then themselves, believing death was preferable to what awaited them. The suicide rates among Japanese female civilians in Manchuria during August and September 1945 would later be documented in memoirs and oral histories, numbers that tell only part of the horror. But then came a complication that no one had predicted, least of all the Japanese women themselves. The Americans arrived. Not in Manchuria itself, the Soviets had claimed that territory as their zone of occupation, but in Korea, just across the border, and later in Japan proper. And with them came policies, attitudes, and protections that stood in stark contrast to what Soviet occupation had meant. By late August 1945, as refugees began flooding south from Manchuria into Korea, American forces encountered streams of traumatized Japanese civilians, mostly women and children, carrying stories of what they had fled. The accounts were consistent, detailed, horrifying. American military intelligence officers documented them methodically, filing reports that climbed the chain of command. What happened next violated every expectation the Japanese women held about their enemies. Fumiko finally escaped Hulin in early September, part of a column of refugees that moved south through chaos, avoiding Soviet patrols, hiding in forests, drinking from streams. She had lost her daughter in the confusion, swept away in a crowd, or taken she would never know, and now moved with the mechanical determination of someone who had stopped hoping and simply endured. The column reached the Korean port city of Wonsan in late September. Soviet forces controlled the northern half of Korea, but the Americans were in the south, and the refugees had heard rumors, impossible rumors, that the Americans were providing food, that they were establishing safe camps, that they were protecting Japanese women. The first time Fumiko saw an American soldier, she tried to run. He was tall, with skin darker than any she had seen, and he wore a uniform she did not recognize. She stumbled, fell, lay on the ground, waiting for what she thought was inevitable. Instead, he extended his hand. Through a translator, a Korean who spoke some Japanese, he asked if she was hurt. He gave her water from his canteen. He directed her to a camp where he said she would be safe. She did not believe him. How could she? The enemy did not protect. The enemy destroyed. That was the natural order of war, confirmed by everything she had witnessed, everything she had been taught. Yet when she reached the camp, she found American military police stationed at the perimeter, and Soviet soldiers kept outside. She found medical tents where Navy corpsmen treated refugees without segregation by nationality. She found distribution points where flour, canned meat, and powdered milk were handed out, not in abundance, for supplies were limited, but without discrimination. She found other women, women who had survived what she had survived, who whispered in disbelief at their own safety. The symbolic object that came to represent this impossible reality was not a weapon or a flag. It was a chocolate bar. American GIs carried them everywhere, tucked in pockets, part of their rations. They gave them to children, Japanese children, Korean children, any children. In a world where food had become a currency of survival, where starvation was a real and present threat for the refugees, this casual generosity seemed almost obscene. The chocolate was rich, sweet, wrapped in paper that crinkled. Children who received it would hold it carefully, uncertain whether to eat it immediately or save it, treasure it, proof that they had encountered something outside their understanding of how conquered people were treated. One American soldier, a corporal from Nebraska named James Thornton, later wrote to his wife about the experience. "These Japanese women look at us like we're going to hurt them. Some of them shake. Then we give them food and they cry. I never thought I'd feel sorry for the Japs after what they did at Bataan. But these are just mothers and kids. They didn't drop the bombs. They didn't torture our boys. They're just scared people who got caught in something bigger than them." This was not universal sentiment among American forces. Many soldiers and Marines who had fought in the Pacific harbored deep hatred for all Japanese, civilian or military. They had seen friends die in banzai charges, had liberated POW camps where American prisoners were skeletal and diseased, had heard about the rape of Nanking and the Manila massacre. The official policy of protection for Japanese civilians came from command levels, driven partly by humanitarian concern, partly by strategic calculation. Winning Japanese cooperation would ease occupation, and partly by American ideological self-image. The United States wanted to demonstrate that it was different from the Soviet Union, that democracy meant something beyond words, that the American way included mercy, even for enemies. But policy alone does not explain what happened in hundreds of small interactions along the Korean-Manchurian border, and later in Japan itself. Something more complicated was at work, a collision between Japanese expectations and American actions that forced a fundamental re-evaluation of wartime propaganda on both sides. Japanese civilians had been taught that Americans were devils, that they would rape and murder, that capture meant death or worse. This was not abstract propaganda, but specific instruction. The Japanese government had distributed cyanide capsules to civilians in Okinawa and prepared them in the home islands, telling mothers to kill their children rather than let them fall into American hands. When Saipan fell in July 1944, hundreds of Japanese civilians had thrown themselves off cliffs rather than surrender, convinced that the Americans would torture them. That conviction was genuine, absolute. So when American soldiers instead provided protection, medical care, and food, the cognitive dissonance was profound. In October 1945, a group of Japanese women who had fled from Manchuria to Seoul found themselves in a refugee center administered by the US Army. Soviet forces occasionally came to the perimeter, seeking laborers, or more ominously, women. The American military police turned them away. This happened not once, but repeatedly, documented in after-action reports filed by American officers, who found themselves in the strange position of protecting their former enemies from their current allies. The tension was real. Soviet commanders complained to American counterparts about interference. The Americans held their ground, citing Geneva Conventions and military government policy. One woman, Keiko Nakamura, who survived this period and later wrote a memoir published in Japan in 1963, described the experience. "We had prepared to die. We had been told the Americans were beasts who showed no mercy. When they showed us mercy instead, we did not know how to understand it. Some of us thought it was a trick, that they were keeping us alive for some worse purpose, but days passed, then weeks, and the protection continued. We began to see that they believed in something different than we had known. Not because they were soft, we had seen them fight, seen them capable of great violence, but because they chose restraint when they had the power to do otherwise. This was not weakness. This was something else, something our education had never taught us to recognize. The transformation this created was not immediate or universal, but it was real. Japanese women who had been prepared to commit suicide rather than face American occupation found themselves instead learning English phrases, accepting employment in American military facilities, and slowly, cautiously, beginning to believe that the war's outcome might not mean their destruction. This had consequences that rippled through the occupation of Japan and shaped the post-war relationship between the two nations. The historical record contains abundant documentation of Soviet atrocities in Manchuria. Soviet archives, opened partially after the Cold War, contain reports from Red Army commanders noting excesses by troops, a euphemism for systematic sexual violence. Japanese government investigations in the post-war period collected testimony from thousands of survivors, creating archives that remained sealed for decades due to shame and trauma. Chinese witnesses in Manchuria also documented what they saw, sometimes with satisfaction. After all, the Japanese had brutalized China for years, sometimes with horror at the scale of suffering, regardless of nationality. The evidence is not ambiguous. Equally well documented, though less discussed in American popular memory, is the protection policy implemented by US forces. Military government records from Korea and Japan contain detailed orders regarding treatment of Japanese civilians, including specific instructions that sexual violence would be prosecuted as a court-martial offense. These were not merely paper policies. American soldiers were court-martialed for assault against Japanese women during the occupation. The rate was not high. American forces were hardly perfect, but the policy was enforced, a dramatic contrast to the Soviet approach. The symbolic power of this contrast cannot be overstated. At the precise moment when Japanese national identity was shattered by defeat, when the entire ideological structure of the empire had collapsed, American behavior provided an alternative narrative. Not the narrative of American innocence, the atomic bombs precluded that, but a narrative of principled restraint, of rules that applied even to enemies, of mercy as strength rather than weakness. Food became the recurring symbol because it was tangible, immediate, and represented abundance. Japan in late 1945 was starving. The blockade had been total, the rice harvest poor, the distribution system collapsed. American relief supplies, brought in by the millions of tons, quite literally kept the population alive through the first winter of occupation. This was not altruism. A starving, desperate population would have been ungovernable, but the Japanese civilians who received the food did not pass those distinctions. They knew only that they had been told Americans would annihilate them, and instead, the Americans were feeding them. One particular incident, recorded in multiple sources, captures the emotional resonance of this contradiction. In November 1945, in a refugee camp outside Seoul, a Japanese woman in her 60s named Haru Tanaka approached an American chaplain through a translator. She asked if it was true that America was a Christian nation. The chaplain confirmed it was, though not uniformly. She then asked whether this explained why the Americans had not killed her. The chaplain, caught off guard, said something about military orders and humanitarian values. She listened, then said through the translator, "I was taught that your Christianity was a lie, that you worshipped only power and money. But you have shown mercy when you did not have to. Perhaps we were wrong about more than just the war." This conversation, preserved in the chaplain's journal and later donated to the Army Heritage and Education Center, represents a turning point in individual consciousness that multiplied across thousands of similar moments. The Japanese women who survived Manchuria and encountered American protection became, in effect, witnesses to an alternative possibility. They carried that testimony back into Japanese society, where it competed with nationalist narratives of victimhood and pride. Over time, in the complex negotiation of post-war Japanese identity, this experience contributed to a willingness to align with the United States, to accept American influence, to build the alliance that would define the Pacific for generations. The contrast with Soviet occupation was stark and deliberate. In Manchuria, in northern Korea, in the Kuril Islands, Japanese civilians who fell under Soviet control faced forced labor, deportation to Siberia, systematic expropriation, and widespread sexual violence. The Soviet Union made no significant effort to provide humanitarian relief to Japanese civilians, viewing them as colonizers who deserved their fate. This was not without justification. Japanese colonialism in Manchuria had been brutal, but it meant that Japanese women and children experienced two radically different occupations, depending on which victor controlled their territory. Those who ended up in American zones told stories of survival and unexpected mercy. Those who remained in Soviet zones told stories of endurance and trauma. The comparison was inevitable, and it shaped Japanese political consciousness for decades. The Japanese left, powerful in the immediate post-war period, had to contend with lived experience that contradicted simple anti-American narratives. Yes, America had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yes, American firebombing had killed hundreds of thousands. But American soldiers had also protected Japanese women from sexual violence, had fed starving children, had enforced rules of occupation that recognized human dignity even in defeat. This was not a fairy tale. American occupation of Japan involved significant violence, exploitation, and abuse. The Recreation and Amusement Association, created by the Japanese government at American request to provide comfort women for occupying troops, was a continuation of sexual slavery under a different name. American soldiers committed crimes against Japanese civilians, some prosecuted, some not. The occupation was an exercise of power, often heavy-handed, always asymmetric. But within that exercise of power there were moments of restraint, instances of protection, and symbols of abundance that created cognitive space for reconciliation. The chocolate bar became legendary. not because chocolate itself was magical, but because it represented a world view. American soldiers gave away chocolate casually, thoughtlessly, in a way that revealed genuine surplus. Japan had spent 4 years under total rationing, every calorie controlled, every resource directed toward war. The idea that a nation could be so wealthy that its soldiers carried luxury food items as routine, that they could give them away to enemy children without thought. This was revelatory. It suggested that American victory was not accidental, that democracy and capitalism had produced not just military power, but genuine abundance. This symbolism was not lost on Japanese observers. Post-war writers and intellectuals grappled with it explicitly. How had the Americans become so powerful? The military answer was industrial capacity, technological innovation, resource access. But the deeper answer, the one that troubled Japanese thinkers, was systemic. Democracy, for all its apparent chaos and inefficiency, had produced a society wealthy enough to be generous. Imperial Japan, for all its discipline and sacrifice, had produced only scarcity and defeat. The women who experienced American protection carried this lesson into the reconstruction of Japanese society. They raised children, taught in schools, worked in businesses, and participated in the political debates that shaped post-war Japan. Their testimony complicated nationalist narratives. It made possible the US-Japan Security Treaty, the long alliance that defined both nations' strategic positions. It created cultural space for American influence in Japanese popular culture, for English language education, for the embrace of democratic institutions, even as Japan maintained its emperor. None of this was inevitable. Had American forces behaved in Japan as Soviet forces behaved in Manchuria, the occupation would have been defined by resistance, sabotage, and lingering hatred. Had American policy been purely punitive, focused on revenge for Pearl Harbor and Bataan, the post-war relationship would have been fundamentally different. Instead, through a combination of strategic calculation and genuine ideological commitment to democratic principles, American forces created conditions where reconciliation became possible. The women who survived Soviet occupation and found protection under American forces became living bridges between wartime enmity and post-war alliance. Their experience was specific, personal, traumatic, and transformative. They had prepared for death and received life. They had expected destruction and encountered protection. They had been taught that their enemies were inhuman and discovered that inhumanity was not distributed according to propaganda. In the spring of 1946, Fumiko, who had lost her daughter in Manchuria, who had survived Soviet occupation and fled south, found herself working in a US Army facility in Tokyo, cleaning offices and learning broken English. One day, an American officer asked her through a translator if she had family. She said no, they were gone. He nodded, said he was sorry, and left. The next day he returned with a photograph of his own family, a wife, 2 daughters, and showed it to her. He said nothing, just showed her the picture, then put it back in his pocket and walked away. She did not understand why he did this until later, when she realized he was showing her that he too was a person, that he too had family he missed, that the war had separated him from what he loved, just as it had separated her. It was a gesture of shared humanity, awkward and incomplete, but real. These moments, small, individual, often clumsy, accumulated into a foundation for peace. Not perfect peace, not peace without resentment or complication, but peace nonetheless. The Japanese women who experienced American protection did not forget what they had suffered, but they also did not forget what they had been spared. That memory shaped their choices, influenced their children, and contributed to a post-war order that, for all its flaws, avoided the cycle of revenge that had defined so much of human history. The epilogue to this story is written in the decades that followed. Japan rebuilt, became an economic power, remained allied with the United States through all the changes of the Cold War and beyond. The women who survived Manchuria grew old, most of them never speaking publicly about what they had endured, carrying their trauma privately. But their children and grandchildren inherited the lesson that enemies could become allies, that mercy was not weakness, that abundance was possible, that democracy, for all its contradictions, had produced a nation capable of restraint, even in total victory. On quiet evenings in Japanese homes, some of those women would occasionally tell parts of their stories to their daughters or granddaughters. They would speak carefully, choosing details, avoiding the worst of what they had seen. And sometimes they would mention small things: the American soldier who gave them water, the chocolate bar that tasted impossibly sweet, the military policeman who stood between them and Soviet troops, the simple fact that they were alive when they had prepared to die. These memories did not erase Hiroshima or Nagasaki, did not undo the suffering of the war, did not absolve anyone of anything. But they created space for something other than hatred, room for something other than revenge. In the end, history is not made only by generals and politicians, by treaties and battles. It is made also by these small moments of unexpected mercy, by gestures that violate expectation, by the choice to protect when power would permit destruction. The Japanese women who survived Soviet occupation and found safety under American forces did not change the grand strategies of nations, but they changed what was possible in the human aftermath of war. They demonstrated that enemies could become something other than enemies, that cycles of violence could be broken, that abundance and mercy could be more powerful than scarcity and revenge. The chocolate bar, casually given, carelessly eaten, represented a world where there was enough food, enough security, enough possibility for generosity. That world was not perfect. America had its own deep injustices, its own hypocrisies. But to women who had known only scarcity and fear, it represented hope. Hope that survival was possible, that rebuilding was possible, that the future did not have to be defined only by the past. And so they lived, and they rebuilt, and they taught their children a complicated truth: that the Americans who had been their enemies had also been their protectors, that the war had ended not with annihilation, but with reconstruction, that mercy was real, even if imperfect, that abundance was possible, even after devastation. This truth, born in trauma and fear, nurtured by unexpected kindness, became one of the foundations of the post-war world. Not the only foundation, not the most important, but real nonetheless. A small truth about large things: that what we choose to do with power matters, that restraint can be more powerful than destruction, that even in the darkest moments of history, human beings retain the capacity to choose mercy over revenge, life over death, hope over despair. The women who survived carried that truth forward, into the peace, into the future, a testimony written not in grand proclamations but in quiet survival, in the raising of children, in the rebuilding of lives. Their story is not the story of the war, but it is a story that could only have emerged from the war, from the collision of propaganda and reality, expectation and experience, fear and unexpected grace. It is a story about what becomes possible when power chooses restraint, when abundance creates generosity, when the enemy becomes the protector, when the chocolate bar given to a frightened child becomes a symbol of something larger than itself, the fragile, imperfect, but real possibility of peace.